I'm Cody Stoots. Welcome into the channel. Is the Houston Texans' future number one wide receiver just a trade away? Could they and should they be going after Tampa Bay Buccaneers wide receiver Mike Evans? That's what we're talking about today here on the video. Would appreciate a thumbs up. Hit the little thumbs up button down below to tell me you like the video. Subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, and check out my website, Houston Football, where I do all my writing about the Houston Texans. www.houfootball.com is where you can find that. Mike Evans, Tampa Bay Buccaneers wide receiver, future Houston Texans wide receiver. Let's talk about it. What exactly is Mike Evans at this point? Well, we know up to this point, Mike Evans has been one of the most reliable wide receivers in all of football. At least 1,000 yards every year that he's played in the NFL. He's been statistically impressive with a variety of quarterbacks. He was almost the offensive rookie of the year with Josh McCown being his primary quarterback. He succeeded multiple times in multiple versions of Jameis Winston being his quarterback, from rookie year Jameis Winston to learned a little bit Jameis Winston to throwing all the interceptions Jameis Winston. Evans was successful with every version of Jameis Winston, and of course he was successful and very impressive with Tom Brady in Brady's final few years of his career teaming up. They won a Super Bowl. There was a lot of touchdowns and a lot of yards from Evans. That was a match made in heaven, and I'm sure Mike Evans very much enjoyed that and is not looking forward to playing potentially a year with Baker Mayfield as his starting quarterback. So what exactly are you getting in Evans? He's going to be 30 years old this year, so 31, 32, 33 the next few seasons, and that's sort of the time when wide receivers drop off a little bit. But even if his level of play dipped just a little bit in, say, the next year or so, and then dipped some more after that, you look at what the Houston Texans have at the wide receiver spot and the avenues that they would have to go to try to find a stud wide receiver. It's not easy to find a wide receiver of Mike Evans's caliber. Most of the wide receivers who are top wide receivers are drafted players, or they are heavily invested in from a trade and contract standpoint. You think about Davante Adams and you think about Tyreek Hill. Not only are those players costly in acquiring them via trade, you also give them a big contract. But then you look around the league and you see some of the successful wide receivers who were draft picks in a variety of different rounds. You think about what Seattle's been able to do over the years with non-first round picks in Tyler Lockett and DK Metcalf. Obviously, you look at Justin Jefferson in Minnesota. He was a drafted player. Amon-Ra St. Brown was a mid-round pick for the Detroit Lions. So you don't have to go out there and sign them in free agency or trade for them. You can draft them, but you look at where the Texans have been over the past couple of years and coming up where they might need to spend some draft capital. It could be difficult to see how you want yet again another young wide receiver in this room. So an established veteran like Mike Evans might be pretty attractive. Now, Evans, not as good right now, and certainly you can't project that he's going to be as good right now as a Tyreek Hill or Davante Adams. So the cost for Mike Evans is a little bit lower in one of those areas. And don't get me started about signing a wide receiver in free agency. Very rarely does an elite wide receiver hit free agency. You just don't ever really have the opportunity to sign one of those guys. I mean, think about who the top wide receivers were in this most recent free agency class. Jacoby Myers. I mean, you just don't get big-time wide receivers that are worth signing to huge deals that they get in free agency, hitting free agency. Yes, every now and then you sign a big deal and it works out. You look at what Christian Kirk was able to do with the Jacksonville Jaguars. Yeah, but I'm not crazy about paying a guy like Christian Kirk the amount of money that Christian Kirk gets. I'd much rather be paying a little bit more for a much more proven and impressive commodity like a guy like Mike Evans. Well, the Texans can't pay him until they get him. So what's the cost in trading for Mike Evans? Well, let's use some of those recent wide receivers we talked about that were acquired in trades as a bit of a barometer for exactly what the Texans might have to give up to go get Mike Evans. Now, understand, with the caveat of talking about trading future draft picks, the Houston Texans still have their first-round pick next year. Let me rephrase that. They still have a first-round pick. Their pick is not theirs. That's the Cardinals now. They still have the Browns selection in the first round. They have their own second-round pick, and then they have the third-round selection that they acquired from the Philadelphia Eagles in a trade that Nick Caserio made on draft day or during the 2023 draft, excuse me. So they've got a little bit of that top of the draft capital, and I would think that the conversation probably starts with Tampa asking for a first-round pick, and then Nick Caserio laughs heartily, hangs up the phone, and waits for them to call back with a more realistic request and a more realistic conversation to pop in. It's not going to be to the same level that it costs to go get Tyreek Hill. Tyreek Hill is in his late 20s, and yes, you're going to have to pay Tyreek Hill just like I would think you're going to end up paying Mike Evans, but Tyreek Hill, more dynamic, more years at his peak left, so he costs more. Same thing with Davante Adams. Davante Adams got his new deal in his very late 20s. He was 29 when he got his new deal, so the Raiders were content to trade for him even though he was going to spend the majority of his 30s, or the majority of the contract in his early 30s. They were content to make that investment, but it was still a hefty investment. Evans is not going to cost the same level as those. I don't believe you'd be trading a first-round pick, and if that's the cost to go get Mike Evans, I'm sorry. I know he's better than Nico Collins. I know he's better than Robert Woods, and I know that it would make all of those guys easier because Nico Collins is better and more attractive as a player when he's the second best option at wide receiver or the third best option at wide receiver. Same goes with Robert Woods. You know, that's what Evans does. He pushes those guys down the pecking order. But if it costs a first-round pick, I'm not even having the conversation. If I'm Nick Caserio, hang up the phone. So let's get realistic here. What would you be willing to give up for Mike Evans? And if you don't like what I would be willing to give up, tell me what you would give up in the comments down below of this video. The conversation probably starts with a second-round pick. Look, I understand that Evans is on the wrong side of 30. In fact, that he's already going to be 30 playing this year. He's on the wrong side of 30, but he's still really productive. And Tampa can't just give the guy away. You would think that they'd be able to improve on what eventually would be a comp pick if he played the whole year and walked away. If a player leaves in free agency, signs a good deal, performs well, typically that team gets a compensation pick from the league. And Evans would certainly, if he hit true free agency, net the Buccaneers a true third-round compensation pick. So the second-round pick, you move that up. You get that a year earlier than you expected. If you're Tampa, it makes a lot of sense to start having the conversations about a second-round pick. Now, for the Texans, is that a extreme cost? It does feel a little bit extreme to be talking about a second-round pick, but part of the investment is not just Mike Evans for 2023. I think that's a big element of the conversation because you can't just give up a second-round pick or even a third-round pick and get 17, 16 games out of Mike Evans. That's not good enough because there's going to have to be a little bit of maneuvering to make Mike Evans work. He's showing up late. Are you getting the maximization of Mike Evans in the first few weeks of the season? If that's the case, so it becomes a pretty costly investment sending a second or a third when it's just Mike Evans for the 2023 season. That's where you've got to figure out Evans' desire. If he wants to go play for a contender, well, the Houston Texans could eventually be a contender. It may be a year or two away. Does he want to sign up for something like that? But if you take care of Mike Evans from a financial standpoint, from a new contract standpoint, perhaps you find yourself with Evans being interested in sticking around in Houston, Evans wanting to come to Houston, and maybe he helps you out and plays a little hardball with Tampa. It's like, I don't really want to go to this team. I don't want to negotiate a contract extension with that team. Then Evans helps you out a little bit, and that lowers a little bit of the compensation or the risk that somebody else gets in a bidding war for Mike Evans. There's another factor, too, and I just talked about it. You got to get Evans on board because if I'm making a trade for Mike Evans and I'm the Houston Texans, I don't want him for just the 2023 season. I'd like 2023, 24, 25, and maybe even a opportunity there for a final year in 2026 with Mike Evans. So what does a contract commitment look like for Mike Evans? Well, this is where I'm not some sort of expert. I just kind of took a look at some of the wide receiver contracts, and there's not a lot of really good wide receivers signing a new contract in their 30s. I mentioned Davante Adams. He signed a contract when he was 29 years old. It's a big contract. Davante Adams is way better than Mike Evans. Okay? So the contract makes sense. Now, the Texans have the money in the future as well. They've got some of the highest cap space in the next few seasons going forward, even with some of the extension commitments they've made in this calendar year. So they've got the money in the future years. The money's a little tight here in the early year. And I talked to my friend Texans Cap, and if you don't follow him on Twitter, you're missing out. He's an expert in all things salary cap. I go to him with all my salary cap questions, and I was talking to him about, hey, how do you make this work? And he's like, well, the money's a little tight this year. Okay, you'd have to change around some contracts, and then you're really hurting your operating budget throughout the 2023 season. And that's something the Texans Cap feels very strongly about, and I understand that's something that Nick Caserio feels very strongly about because he mentions it a lot. He mentions about how they have to have money to do things over the course of the season from time to time. So you don't want to totally crush that, but you can change that and alter that a little bit once you get Evans in, if you get him signed to a new contract. So again, what does the Mike Evans contract look like? Well, I would think that he's not taking anything less than $20 million a year, because I understand there's a financial there's a draft pick commitment to Mike Evans, but Evans has to kind of look at this almost as free agency. He'd be one of the better wide receivers to ever hit free agency. And you start thinking about some of these contracts that wide receivers have signed in recent years, and Evans is already seemingly underpaid for his production. So why is he going out there and taking a deal of any sort with any team? You know, especially if you're going to have to pay initially the bad team tax like the Texans may have to do. Because if Evans wants to play on a contender, this is a whole non-starter. But if he's willing to hear the conversation, play close to somewhere where he grew up, Galveston, and get paid, the Texans have the salary cap space, it's a match that works pretty well. So are you committing $20 million a year, $20 million plus a year to Mike Evans? It becomes a very, very tough commitment, but what else are you spending the money on in the next couple of years? Yes, I know free agency, and I know there's going to be some fun and interesting free agents pop up in the next couple of years, but how many of them are actually going to be wide receivers? Again, it's the opportunity to go out there and add this number one wide receiver. So is it a 4-year commitment at $20 million a year? How many of us would be comfortable with the Texans signing a 30-year-old wide receiver to a 4-year, $80 million contract? That's a pretty tough level to get to. So again, that's another one of those hurdles there for acquiring Mike Evans. Ultimately, in summary, it seems like it's a very tough thing to do for the Texans. It's hard to give up the draft compensation because it's starting with at least a second-round pick and maybe more if you need Tampa to help you out with some of the money before you get the contract done with Mike Evans. The contract extension is just too much. And I get that it's just money. You get more money. The salary cap's going to keep going up. But I just don't feel confident committing what it seems Mike Evans may want to him in age 31, 32, 33 with this Texans team. It'd be great for CJ Stroud. It'd be a fantastic element of this offense in the early years. I'm sure Bobby Slowick, the offensive coordinator, could find out a bunch of different fun ways to use Mike Evans. But ultimately, I don't see how Evans gets done. It gets a thumbs down. I want it to happen. Mike Evans is a great dude. He's a fantastic football player. But I just don't see how the Houston Texans can get it done. I do see how we're going to have some fun stuff on the channel here coming up for you on YouTube. Appreciate you watching. If you enjoyed the video, hit the thumbs up button down below. Subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. And so much fun stuff coming on Houston football and here on YouTube as the season's kickoff is right around the corner. So we've got plenty of preview things coming your way here from a video standpoint as well as on Houston football. Check it out in the description down below, or www.houfootball.com is where you can find it. Can't wait till we talk Texans again soon.